Many online apologists spend a great deal of time trying to separate the books of Genesis and older myths from the ancient Near East. The suggestion that the stories of creation, Adam and Eve, flood, and the Tower of Babel are later than and dependent upon older mythologies from the surrounding cultures will often spark a fight. Why would they be so threatened by the idea that the Old Testament got many of its literary traditions from earlier ancient Near Eastern myths? I leave that for you to answer. In my experience, certain views of the inspiration of the Bible require that it be a type of standalone text handed down from God on high, taking nothing and relying in no way on the cultures and traditions surrounding the ancient authors. It is thought under this interpretive model that the biblical authors are being accused of stealing or plagiarizing these stories from the surrounding nations, thereby invalidating their divine source and authority. Whatever theological conclusion one may come to, however, there can be little doubt that many of the stories, traditions, themes, and motifs find their way into the origins and other earlier and ancient Near Eastern mythologies. But how do we know that the Old Testament writers used and depended on older myths from the surrounding regions? In this series, based on the work of Dr. Joshua Bowen, in the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 2, we will address several ways in which scholars have made this determination. The structure of this series will be formed in the following way. First, we will walk the reader through an example of literary borrowing that comes not from the Old Testament, but from the Akkadian literary text, from Mesopotamia in the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. It is from this period, long before the time of the biblical writers, that we see an earlier story called the Anzu myth being used by a later myth known as the Enuma Elish. In the later composition, parts of the earlier myth are reused and reworked for the author's new purposes, all within the context of Akkadian literature. With this process clear in mind, in the second video, we will turn our attention to the Old Testament itself, beginning with Genesis 1 through 11. We will look at how the passages like Genesis 1 use and respond to Mesopotamian stories like Enuma Elish. More broadly, we will see how the whole narrative can be found in Genesis 1 through 11 was structured in such a way so as to respond and polemicize ideas held dear to ancient Mesopotamian civilization. In the final video of this series, we will examine the story of the Garden of Eden as well as the flood story of Genesis 6 through 9, and see how these stories borrowed from and engaged with earlier mythologies and mythological traditions. In doing so, we will see how the biblical authors utilized themes, motifs, and other literary features of the time to make their own theological messages clear to their audiences. In the end, we will review what we have learned in an attempt to rethink how we should approach these ancient texts. Should we view a biblical writer utilizing an earlier foreign story or myth, working it into their own textual production as a form of ancient plagiarism, or is there another way to interpret this practice? Let's find out. Intertextuality, an example from Akkadian mythology. I would like to take a few minutes to present a case of intertextuality that comes from outside of the Hebrew Bible, and that is agreed by the relevant specialist in the field to be an example of one text borrowing from another text. By establishing a firm example of this type of borrowing and reworking of an earlier text, particularly for the theological purposes, this will set up to understand more clearly how the biblical authors are constructing many of their stories. The Anzu myth. During the first half of the 2nd millennium BCE, there was a myth written in Akkadian language that we refer to as the Anzu myth. In the story, the god Enlil possesses a magical item known as the Tablet of Destinies, which is described by Benjamin Foster as an object that, quote, gave its possessor the power to give especially powerful commands. In the Anzu story, the tablet gave the power to control divine spheres of responsibility and thus universal authority, end quote. The Anzu bird, a powerful mythological creature, is selected by Enlil to guard his residence. However, as time passes, the Anzu bird begins to desire the power given by the Tablet of Destinies for himself. One day, while Enlil is bathing, Anzu decides to make his move. I myself will take the gods' tablet of destinies. Then I will gather to myself the responsibility of all the gods. I will have the throne for myself. I will take power over authority. I will be the commander of each and every god. After stealing the tablet, the Anzu bird flies off into the mountains, which results in general chaos falling over the divine world. At this point, something must be done to get the tablet of destinies back from Anzu. The god Anu appeals to the god Adad to kill Anzu and retrieve the tablet, promising him that he will be made greatest among the gods. However, Adad replies, "Woe! Who of your children can defeat Anzu? He has taken control of the tablet of destinies. He has snatched supremacy from God. He has soared off to his mountain. He has lifted high his head. His command has become like that of divine Duranki Enlil. If he commands, the one who he curses will turn into clay." Adad thus refuses to go fight Anzu, given his control of the Tablet of Destinies and the impossibility, in his view, of defeating someone with such power. Anu then approaches the gods Giru and Shara, who respond in exactly the same way. No one is willing to fight Anzu while he is in control of the Tablet of Destinies. Thus enters our hero on the scene. Ea tells Anu that he will appoint someone and sends Belet to appoint her son, Ninurta, to fight Anzu. "Give us the mighty one, your superb beloved, broad of chest, who leads the 7 combats. Ningirsu, the mighty one, your superb beloved, broad chest, who leads the 7 combats." In her speech to Ninurta, she charges him, cut short his life, conquer Anzu. "Let the winds bear off his wing feathers as glad tidings to Inker. To your father, let the winds bear off his wing feathers as glad tidings." We will return to these lines later in this section as they appear in the other story in a slightly different form. Ninurta indeed goes out to fight Anzu, but the bird proves to be a formidable foe. Just as everyone expects, with Anzu firmly in control of the Tablet of Destinies, there is little that Ninurta can do. In the midst of the melee, the conflict battle was joined, the deluge onset. Battle array was on the move, bathed in blood. Clouds of death rained down. Arrows flashed as lightning. Battle ran on, thundering between them. From the handhold of the bow, he sent against him an arrow. The shaft did not approach Anzu, but returned. Anzu cried out against it, "Shaft that has come, go back to your thicket, frame of the bow to your forests. Bowstring to the sheep's sinews, feather to the birds go back." Because he held the Tablet of Destinies of the gods in his hand. The bowstring brought forth arrows, but they did not approach his body. We learn several things from this passage. First, Anzu is a serious opponent. He's described in terms that indicate he is ferocious as a warrior, clearly on par with Ninurta. Second, because he controls the Tablet of Destinies. He controls aspects of reality itself. As Ninurta shoots arrows at him, Anzu commands the arrows and the bow to go back away from him. His word brings this to pass, and the arrows cannot reach him. Ninurta, with all his power, cannot defeat Anzu. Realizing that he is outmatched, Ninurta sends word to Ea, known for wisdom and cunning, asking for advice on how to defeat Anzu. Although Ea's response might seem odd to us, it was quite fitting in the story's context. "Do not retire in battle," Ea says. "Strive for victory. Tire him. Tire Anzu out, that he let his wings fall to the brunt of the storm. Take, O Lord, your darts toward the bottom. Cut off his pinions and hurl them right and left. Once he sees his feathers, they will take away his magic words. My wings. To the wings he will cry. Fear him not. Ready your bow. Let the lightning shafts fly from it, and let pinions and winged feathers dance like butterflies." What are we to make of these odd-sounding instructions? Most interpreters understand Ea's advice as a trick on the Anzu bird. Ninurta is to fight with Anzu again, and when the battle is at its height, the Anzu lowers his wings in exhaustion. Ninurta is to cut off the bird's pinions. When Anzu, ostensibly using the Tablet of Destinies, calls for his pinions to return to him, Ninurta is to shoot an arrow because arrows have feathers on them. The magical words of Anzu will not only bring his pinions back to him, but also the feathers of the arrow and the arrow itself. As you might expect, the ruse succeeds, and Ninurta kills Anzu. While there is obviously much more to this story, these are the salient details for our purposes. However, we should consider again the lines that follow Ninurta's defeat of the Anzu bird. The text reads, quote, "He killed wicked Anzu. The warrior Ninurta took control of the tablet of the gods' destinies. The wind bore Anzu's wing feathers as a sign of his glad tidings." End quote. This set of repeated lines appear throughout this story and form an important structural component to the overall composition. This leads us to the well-known Akkadian myth, the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish, one of the most famous stories in all Akkadian literature, perhaps ranking second only to the Epic of Gilgamesh, is a 7-tablet composition known by its first 2 words of the first line, Enuma Elish. When above, the heavens did not exist. This masterpiece of ancient literature most likely dates to the middle or second half of the 2nd millennium BCE. Lambert writes, the present writer knows of no evidence contradicting a Middle Babylonian, circa 1600 to 1150 BCE, date, and this for the present is the most likely time of the epic's composition. Without going into all the details of the story, I would like to provide the reader with the most important details pertaining to its relationship with the other mythological text under discussion, as we did for the Anzu myth. The Enuma Elish has been called the Babylonian creation myth, and not without reason. The main focus of the story is the rise of the Babylonian god Marduk to supremacy over the divine pantheon, and tells of his creation of the world, at least in part of the text. After the initial creation of the gods and some internal turmoil that results from the gods making too much noise, the god Apsu plans to destroy the gods. Ea, however, learns of Apsu's plan and kills him, taking over his residence. There, Ea and his wife Damkina give birth to Marduk, who is large and powerful. Anu gives Marduk the 4 winds, and as Marduk disruptively plays with them, the sea goddess Tiamat, along with several gods, plan to kill Marduk and the other gods. She creates monsters to her aid, along with her spouse, Kingu. The text then reads, she gave him that tablet of destinies and fastened it to his breast, saying, your order may not be changed. Let the utterance of your mouth be firm. Ea learns of Tiamat's plan and tells it to one of the more senior deities, Anshar, who commands Ea to go and appease her. However, on his way, he realizes that the mission is futile. He tells Anshar, my father Tiamat's deeds are too much for me. I perceived her planning, but my incantation was not equal to it. Her strength is mighty. She is full of dread. She is altogether very strong. None can go against her. Anshar then approaches Anu, who responds in exactly the same way. Tiamat is too mighty, and no one can stand against her. Anshar then becomes angry and abandons his efforts to find someone to go and confront Tiamat. At this point, you might be saying to yourself, hey, this sounds an awful like the plot from the Anzu myth. Not only is there an imminent threat to the gods from a divine being on whose side is the Tablet of Destinies, but there is also the motif of a god sending out other deities to confront the threatening divine figure. We will not delve deeply into this particular comparison, but notice that in the Anzu myth, the deities that are sent out are Adad, Giru, and Shera, more minor deities, while in Enuma Elish, the gods Ea, Anu are sent. They're major deities. In other words, 2 of the most senior deities in the pantheon are sent out against Tiamat, but neither are a match for her. This difference is employed to emphasize the great power of the god that would eventually go against Tiamat, Marduk. As in the Anzu myth, the hero of the story is approached. However, in this case, Marduk is asked by Ea to go and calm Anshar. Entering in before Anshar, Marduk states, "My father, do not hold your peace, but speak forth. I will go and fulfill your desires. My father, begetter, rejoice and be glad. Soon you will tread on the neck of Tiamat." Although this may be a slight difference, it is worth noting, while Ninurta was asked to go and fight Anzu, Marduk appears essentially to volunteer. Marduk is so fierce and mighty that he seeks out the battle where the other major deities have turned back in fear. The gods decree that Marduk will be the most honored among all the gods, and whatever he commands will be carried out. After performing deeds to show his power and authority, they gave him an irresistible weapon that overwhelms the foe, they said. "Go cut Tiamat's throat, and let the winds bear up her blood to give the news." Sound familiar? We will come back to it shortly. As Marduk approaches, we see the following. He, Marduk, observed the tricks of Kingu, her spouse. As he looked, he, Kingu, lost his nerve. His determination went and he faltered. His divine aides, who were marching at his side, saw the warrior, the foremost, and their vision became dim. Much to everyone's surprise, the one who held the famous tablet of destinies was not only unable to defend himself from Marduk, but both he and his forces were defeated simply at Marduk's approach. Comparing this to the long, hard-fought battles that Ninurta had with Anzu, in which he was not able to defeat Anzu by strength, Marduk is able to topple the one who wields the Tablet of Destinies without even having to raise a finger against him. Marduk then presses forward to fight against Tiamat. Tiamat and Marduk, the sage of the gods, came together, joining in strife, drawing near to the battle. Bel Marduk spread out his net and enmeshed her. He let loose the evil wind, the rear guard in her face. Tiamat opened her mouth to swallow it. He let fly an arrow and pierced her belly. He tore open her entrails and split her inwards. He bound her and extinguished her life. He threw down her corpse and stood on it. As the gods had commissioned him to do, he severed her arteries and let the north wind bear up her blood to give the news. What can we say about these two stories and how they relate to one another? In 1986, Wilfred Lambert published an article drawing literary connections between the Anzu myth and Enuma Elish. Other articles followed in a similar vein, including those by Peter Manchinist, Andrea Siri, and more recently Selena Wisnam. The conclusions drawn by these and other scholars agree that the Enuma Elish is borrowing heavily on the earlier Anzu myth, developing the story in such a way that Marduk is shown to be the new and improved Ninurta. Two significant points of comparison are the shared language that appears in both mythological texts, along with the presence and manipulation of the Tablet of Destinies motif. Earlier, we noted the call by the gods in the Anzu myth for Ninurta to have the wind carry the feathers of Anzu back to them to declare his victory over the mythological creature. As we have seen, similar but not identical verbiage is used. In Enuma Elish, with feathers being replaced instead, blood. Lambert pointed out that the language of wind carrying feathers makes sense, while wind carrying away blood is less coherent. He writes, "Wind easily picks up feathers, less easily blood." This is likely an example of a blind motif that we discussed above, which would provide specific evidence for intertextuality between these two compositions. Another point of contact and reworking is the Tablet of Destinies. In the Anzu myth, the Tablet of Destinies is a powerful magical weapon that enables the holder to control nature. Ninurta, the hero of the story, with all his power, is still unable to defeat the one wielding such a weapon. However, in the Enuma Elish, the one who holds the Tablet of Destinies is absolutely no match for the supreme power of Marduk. Not only does it fail to give Kingu the necessary strength to defend himself against Marduk, but it is also completely ineffective as Marduk's power is overwhelming even before any battle has even taken place. These points of contact are clear between the two texts, but the author of the Enuma Elish uses these allusions to make a different theological point. Marduk is even greater than the incredibly powerful warrior god, Ninurta. As you can see, these two Mesopotamian stories were quite closely connected, with the latter story borrowing from the reworking the earlier myth in order to make a clear set of theological points. As you can see, these two Mesopotamian stories were closely connected, with the later story borrowing from and reworking the earlier myth in order to make a clear set of theological points. Now that we have seen how this is done in another part of the ancient world, we can turn our attention to the Old Testament. Did the writers of the Bible do something similar to their Mesopotamian scribal predecessors? Did they borrow from earlier myths to tell stories all their own? Please get you a copy of the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. Volume 1 and Volume 2 are out right now, but thanks to Dr. Joshua Bowen for helping me in learning about these ancient myths and how they may have impacted the Bible. You may want to see the coming series as we unravel the evidence showing that the Bible is borrowing from older mythologies.